you'll realize that the body is a prison that traps and bends the natural spirit to its will. It makes us into men or women, or whatever it likes.
This is a line from the 1972 horror film Private Parts, which out of context can be considered transpositive. However, within the film's context, this line is intended to be outlandish, something for the audience to sneer at. It's said by one of the two main antagonists, who the audience is supposed to think of as irrational and crazy. Today, we're going to be looking at the depiction of trans characters in horror movies from the 1960s and 1970s. Generally, movies from this era capitalize on the palpably changing attitudes about race, class, gender, and matters of sexuality. Therefore, the increasing demand for trans rights in the 1960s resulted in more movies featuring queer people, for better or for worse, given the dubious and bad faith natures of many of these representations, and this includes horror movies. The othering of trans people is a common thread in the 1960s and 1970s horror films. Trans bodies have long been depicted in cinema in the most salacious and deviant contexts, and this has been met without much protest from the mainstream society that absorbs those images. These depictions were not positive, nor ever meant to represent the trans communities. Despite the push for trans rights in the 60s, the following decade incurred a backlash against trans people from all sides of the political and social spectrum. This decade also marked the rise of radical feminists, otherwise known as radfems, who demonize trans people. Their narrative is that all men are born evil. Radfems incorrectly believe that trans men are women with internalized misogyny and trans women are men who want to invade women's spaces, which is rather paternalistic for a group who claims to be against patriarchy. Reactionary conservatives pushed against trans desires for acceptance that they believe challenged traditional ways of life. Many states had laws against cross-dressing, which continue to exist today and marginalize queer people, with the covert, but not so covert, goal of persecuting trans people. Let's return to Private Parts. In this American film, a young girl named Cheryl seeks refuge at her controlling aunt's hotel, where an obsessive murderer lurks. This murderer is her cousin George, who also happens to be a trans man. It is implied that Cheryl's aunt / George's mother had raised him as a man from childhood because she believed that women are inherently promiscuous and inferior to men. The abusive and manipulative relationship between George and his mother is a prophetic of the modern-day right-wing hysteria that leftist society and parents of trans children force gender ideology onto their kids. It is also reminiscent of radfem ideology. George is depicted as a freak before we're even aware that he's trans. This revelation is meant to confirm the audience's suspicions about him. He is an aberration, a sicko. He grooms Cheryl into a relationship even though he's aware that they're cousins, though she's not. Cheryl is constantly denied her womanhood / femininity because she appears young. George preys on her desperation to be seen as a woman to flatter her into pursuing a relationship with him. This plays into the popular grooming narrative in transphobic right-wing media nowadays. He also has violent and sexual tendencies. He tapes a picture of Cheryl's face to a sex doll, which he fills with water and injects blood into using a syringe. He tries to reenact this fantasy with Cheryl during their intimate encounter at the end of the film. This scene is fraught with undertones of medical fear-mongering and sexual assault. Why is George so obsessed with stabbing people with his blood via syringe? Is it a substitution for a phallic organ he doesn't have? His strange sexual fantasies reflect harmful and unfair stereotypes of trans people, namely perversion and deviancy. Not to mention, he's also a serial killer who has previously killed another woman he was infatuated with. Overall, the movie stigmatizes trans people and the people who support them, like George's aunt. The theme of transness and controlling parental relationships is also evident in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho from 1960. The film builds tension through the murders that occur at a hotel owned by the villain, Norman Bates. Interestingly, it's another trans movie that takes place in some kind of lodging, who is revealed to keep his dead mother's corpse around and take on her personality when he kills people. This personality includes Norman wearing a wig and dress. At the end of the film, Norman's mom's personality is said to have taken over. Another movie which ignorantly links transness to deviance and violence is the 1970 satirical film Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. This film, directed by Russ Myers, with a screenplay from Roger Ebert, parodies the 1967 film Valley of the Dolls. The movie centers on the exploits of Kelly McNamara, a singer in a female rock band who travels to Los Angeles to visit her aunt. There she meets Z-Man, a music producer who introduces her to the world of the late 60s / early 70s hippie debauchery, rich with drugs, sex, and finally, shocking violence. In the final act, Z-Man is revealed to be transgender, or possibly a crossdresser. This is handled with little grace as a shocking plot twist meant to further propel the madness of the final act, a revelation that occurs after he sexually harasses another male character who rebukes his advances. Z-Man then reveals his breasts, to which the other character exclaims,
"You've been a broad all along, right, Barzell? Goddamn broad! Goddamn ugly broad, Barzell!"
prompting Z-Man to enter a murderous rampage. Curiously, Z-Man seems to identify as a male until the last 20 minutes. For almost the entirety of the film, we assume he's a cisgender man. He presents as male, uses he/him pronouns, and seems to have no problem being referred to as such. Furthermore, he is based on the IRL music producer and murderer Phil Spector, who is not trans. In the final act, however, he is suddenly insistent on referring to himself as Superwoman, while donning a flamboyant princely costume and wearing eyeliner. This confusion stems from Ebert and Myers and reflects societal attitudes towards trans people at that time. According to Ebert, who wrote the screenplay for the film, Z-Man is a woman in drag. In the 1960s and 1970s, the delineation between queer people, trans people, people who dress in drag, or crossdressers was not as well established as it is today, nor were there as many labels. Describing her experience at drag balls, Miss Major, a black trans woman, said, "We didn't know at the time that we were questioning our gender. We just knew that it felt right. There wasn't all this terminology, all this labeling. You know what I mean?" At the end of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, all of the trans and queer characters die or are defeated, leaving the upright heterosexuals to have a joint wedding. This reinforces hegemonic ideas of heterosexuality. Despite the increase in possibilities for independent filmmaking in the 1960s and 1970s with the popularity of 60mm and 8mm film, virtually no transpositive horror exists from this time period. Mainstream horror is reactionary. It does not challenge ideas. It feeds into them. Much like the slasher movies of the 1970s and 1980s feed into paranoia about intruders who menace suburban life. It was narratively easier to utilize trans people as a shorthand for deranged and perverted people. The horror aspects of this movie are contingent on the trans identity of the villain. This movie functions because the villain is trans.